Horae Apocalypticae, Volume 1, an historicist commentary on the Revelation, updated and revised for the 21st century, derived from the original work of E.B. Elliott. Read by yours truly, Nicholas Arthur. Part 1, Chapter 3, The Third Seal. Continued. Let us now, as under the previous seal, compare the history with the prophecy in respect, first, of the fiscal evil itself, as causing the dark color of distress at the time prophetically indicated on the emblematic horse, second, of its administrators as signified by the horse rider, and words addressed to him from the throne. Number 1. Now, as regards our first point of inquiry, the historic epoch well accords, of course, with the chronological position of the hieroglyphic before us, following closely as it did on the era of the introduction of the military despotism depicted under the second seal, and preceding that of the mortality under Valerian and Gallienus, the subject, as will soon appear, I doubt not, of the fourth. Further, another point of agreement will be obvious in the identity of the articles of produce on which the Roman taxation fell with those noted in the vision. For the former, like the latter, comprehend both corn produce, including wheat and barley, and also, from such of the provinces as best produced them, wine and oil. And let me add that the system of the largesse, as about this time acted out on a large scale at Rome, they were all, or nearly all, included, and so must be the evil aggravated that we speak of. At first it was otherwise. For a long time corn only was distributed to the citizens. The largesse of oil given on one occasion by Julius Caesar was an extraordinary donative, and not repeated. Again, when Augustus was petitioned to supply them with wine, he declined. In the reign of Septimus Severus, however, father to Caracalla, the largesse of oil was again accorded, after a short intermission under Elagabalus, the donative renewed and established by Alexander Severus, not very long after which wine may perhaps also have been granted to them by Aurelian, so that the time to which I refer, the voice in the vision, not only were all the 4 items of taxation mentioned in the vision regularly in requisition from the produce-paying provinces, but 3 out of the 4 had received aggravation from the system of largesse above mentioned, as did soon after the 4th also. We shall be too often summoned, says Gibbon, to explain the land tax, the capitation, and the heavy contributions of corn, wine, oil, and meat, which were exacted from the provinces for the use of the court, the army, and of the capital. What Gibbon here alludes to is given with reference, more particularly, to the times and financial system of Diocletian, but, as before observed, there is good evidence of this oppressive branch of the Roman fiscal system having been in operation throughout nearly the whole of the half-century from Caracalla's decree to Diocletian's accession. As to the state of the Roman people as affected by the evil spoken of, and its accordance with the black color of the horse, the sign of distress and impoverishment in the body politic, it has already been observed on and is equally evident. Indeed, in the graphic descriptions of Gibbon, the very trope of the black color of this third horse is adopted, just as of the white and red of the 2 seals preceding, to illustrate the effect of the evil with reference both to its earlier and later operation. He speaks of the dark prospect of distress and calamities bequeathed through Caracalla's profligacy to his successors, and how this fiscal evil as a noxious weed sprang up again with the most luxurious growth, and in the succeeding age darkened the Roman world with its deadly shade." Unquote. Number 2. Nor, I think, as designative of the agents in these oppressions, whom I suppose the rider of the black horse to have represented, in other words, the provincial presidents, proconsuls, or procurators, to whom, as to the praetors and quaestors of the old republic before them, was now entrusted in each province with the collection of the produce and the revenue. Will the apocalyptic twofold indication here given be found less characteristic? I mean, the indication, first, of the words addressed to the black horse rider from the throne, secondly, of the balance held in his hand. As to the words, it was obvious respecting persons in offices like those of the provincial proconsuls that, as opportunities abounded for exaction, more especially in respect of payments in kind or of purchases in kind, when extra supplies, as was often the case, were required by the sovereign government at Rome, so unless rigorously checked, abuse of those opportunities was likely to follow. In early times this forced itself on the notice of the Roman Senate and people, and precautionary laws were enacted by them, laws adopted and added subsequently by the emperors. They were styled laws de repetitiis, or against extortion and injustice on the part of the provincial governors, and in their general charges against injustice well corresponded, it will be observed, with the tone and spirit of the monition to the writer in the text, besides which, and with the same object of preventing injustice, particular precautionary provisions were sometimes, in other laws, made against it, especially by naming the price at which the governor was to rate and purchase. I may cite as a specimen of the Cassian frumentarian law, and really the expressions in it are so remarkably similar to the words pronounced in the apocalyptic vision, so illustrative of their perceptive and admonitory character, and of the object and meaning in that character of the charge they contain as to the price of corn, as to seem like an actual comment of explanation on them, it having been enacted, at the instance of Cassius, that 800,000 modi of wheat should be bought for the citizens of Rome by the provincial authorities, the price to be paid for it, about the fair market price at the time, was by the legislating supreme government enjoined upon those authorities, in a phrase brief and simple, like that in the text, a modus of wheat for a denarius. Such was at that time the admonitory direction of the supreme law and government at Rome to the provincial authorities. Such was the naming of the price of corn and the object of it. Nor was the case different afterwards with any of the truly justice-loving emperors, whether urging the thing with a successful effect, like Trajan and the Antonines, or, like Alexander Severus, less successfully. And how did such monitory laws arise? Surely, forasmuch both these and the general laws against extortion were conceived in the spirit of equity, they might well be considered as emanating not only from the subordinate earthly powers ordained by God, but from Him, the habitation of whose throne is justice and judgment, and who has solemnly declared Himself in His written law against all defrauding, oppression, and wrong, even the same that in the apocalyptic visions sat enthroned in the midst of the living creatures, God Himself. For, as Hooker beautifully says, of law there can be no less acknowledged than that her seat is in the bosom of God, a truth which even the heathen Romans had acknowledged. The price of wheat named in the Cassian law varied indeed greatly, as will be seen, from the one here mentioned, the former being a denarius for a modius, the latter a denarius for a koinix, or eighth part of a modius, that is, if we follow the most natural hypothesis about the koinix. and suppose the common Attic coinix to be the one intended. But it is to be remembered that as time went on, and the Republic passed into an empire, and the empire became settled and mature, great changes took place in the price of corn throughout the Roman Empire, under which circumstances changed proportionate, of course, occurred in the amount of price equitably dictated to the provincial governors in the laws of equitable emperors, at which to estimate, to buy, and indeed also to sell. Of the average price at the period not very long before the apocalyptic vision, we have seen already authentic record in the elder Pliny, who died AD 79, 2 years only before Domitian's accession, stating it as then about 3 denarius the modus, or 3 times greater than in the age of Cassius. This price would seem to have continued pretty much the average through the prosperous times of the 2nd century, after which it declined till it stood at just half Pliny price under the Constantinian emperors in the first half of the 4th century. And on the reasonable hypothesis of the decline having progressed nearly about 1/3 at the opening of the 2nd quarter of the 3rd century, the date of the reign of Alexander Severus, the average price at that time might have been about 2 denarii and a half for the modius of wheat, or near 1/3 of a denarius for the Attic coinix. But how, then? The price is still altogether at variance with that enunciated in the apocalyptic vision, a coinix of wheat for a whole denarius. Hence, in truth, at first sight, a great difficulty. Indeed, for a long time it seemed to me insurmountable, on the hypothesis of the Attic coinix, and I fell back in consequence on the supposition of the larger and less common coinix of 8 cotylae being meant as its best solution. But I had overlooked one most important element for the consideration in the question, which at once sets all right, vis-a-vis the intrinsic value of the denarius at the time supposed to be depicted in the vision. For so it is, and I now find that though the denarius for centuries previous, under both republic and emperors, had been always scrupulously coined of pure silver, yet from the commencement of the 3rd century it began to be gradually more and more adulterated, to the value of 1/2 in the reign of the 1st Severus, and in the reign of the 2nd Severus to the value of just 2/3. So that, as under the last mentioned prince, the denarius had but 1/3 the silver, and consequently but 1/3 the value of the older and standard denarius. The apocalyptic charge, a coinix of wheat for denarius, proves to have been the literally true expression of about its average price at that particular era. Surely the coincidence must be deemed very remarkable. As to the price of the barley specified in the voice from the throne, it is considerably lower than its usual proportion to that of wheat, it being but 1/3, not as more commonly 1/2, but there does not seem to be here anything in our hypothesis inconsistent with historic probability. Alexander Severus's large and celebrated procurations of corn in considerable measure accounting for it, since these were doubtless most by far of wheat. Let me observe, before passing from this subject, that the apocalyptic specification on the denarius as the standard money price, in the voice from the throne, may perhaps have been common at Rome, as language borrowed from the Cassian law, a price involving the specification also of that small wheat measure, the coinix, rather than the modius. But chiefly, I conceive, this is specified to indicate how low the taxation would descend, and consequently its universal oppressiveness. And let it be understood that the idea that measures thus small might have been specified as well as larger, and in the Roman laws of that period, is not the mere conjecture of the expositor, with a view to suit the language of the prophetic figuration before us. There is still extant direct historical evidence that such was the case, in record both of measures and weights, and as an object of the very careful and serious legislation, with a view specifically to that which we have explained as the intent of the voice from the throne, the protection of the tributaries of the empire from unjust extraction on the part of the extractors of tribute. So in a law Valentinian, which orders small standard measures as well as the larger modius, and corresponding weights also, to be placed in every city, in order that every tributary might see whether more was extracted than his due, and punishment follows surely on the fiscal exactor. Moreover, somewhat remarkably, an ancient weight of 2 pounds, just equivalent to the Koinix measure of wheat, has been lately made the subject of critical examination at Rome, one stamped, it seems, as a government weight under the direction of one of the market overseers of Alexander Severus, and issued doubtless with the same equitable object in the view as Valentinians, as well as for the general use of buyers and sellers in the market. Thus is the specified price and measure, as well as all else, found to suit our view of the rider in the third seal, though with special reference, insofar as regards the apocalyptic voice as from the throne, to the reclamation of the law of equity under Alexander Severus. And indeed I cannot but think that to St. John those words enjoining the price of wheat and barley must almost of themselves have suggested imperial provincial governors as the parties addressed under the figure of the rider, just as the monitory words of the Cassian law might in earlier times have suggested the provincial administrators of the old republic, more especially as there was added that other monition, in the same spirit of equity, about the wine and the oil, precisely the like to which seems to have been enjoined from time to time on the provincial presidents by the more justice-minded emperors, in connection with the imperial exaction of wine and oil in their canon Frumentarius. If, however, of itself, this indication might appear insufficient, the second and additional indication of the rider's holding a balance would, I conceive, then conjoined with the former, have sufficed to set all doubt aside on the point. For the balance, from being the emblem of justice, came to be an official badge of those that were appointed to the administration of justice, such as the praetors at Rome and the provincial governors in the provinces, which latter, accordingly, under the old republic, used sometimes to have a balance over the cruel chair of their high office, on coins struck in connection with their appointment, and, together therewith, sometimes also an ear of corn, or it might be a Roman measure, with reference to the procuration of corn charged more or less directly upon them, just as in the metals pictured above. In imperial times, indeed, the supreme judicial and financial, as well as supreme military power, centered in the emperors, whence the ascription to them of the balance of justice, whether in historic writings or on imperial coins, such as that of Alexander Severus here, with the legend Equatus Augusti around it, but the authority that the balance indicated, as well as that indicated by the sword, was delegated, of course, by them to their subordinate provincial and financial governors, just as in other times. And another country, it was said by Henry V to the English Lord Chief Justice, "Hold thou still the balance and the sword." Which being so, and the two apocalyptic indications of the figured balance and the monitory voice as from the throne against injustice in regard of corn, wine, and oil, being thus conjointly characteristic and distinctive of a Roman provincial governor, on which to go forth publicly to his province, as well as to the military proprietor, so that in respect of the black horse rider, as well as of the rider of the red horse, the apocalyptic emblem might be considered as one drawn from life. And now I think we may draw to a conclusion. We have seen what were the charges to equity addressed to the provincial governors, and their very badge of the balance might seem almost a profession of equity. But they were professions from Caracalla's time, the earliest included in our vision, with few and brief exceptions almost always falsified, and the injunctions of the law to equity, however solemn, for the most part altogether in vain. Those, says Gibbon, who had learning enough to read the orations of Cicero against Verus, might instruct themselves in all the various arts of oppression with regard to the weight, the price, the quality, and the carriage, and the avarice of an unlettered governor would supply the ignorance of precept or precedent." Unquote. The robbers of the provinces was both Severus's and Aurelian's just appellation of them. Moreover, as in the wide-extending branches of fiscal administration they acted out this mockery of justice, so also in the judicial and general administration. Hence the solution of the enigma, which at first sight seems scarcely explicable, how, under the influences of one that held the balance of equity as his badge, the aspect of the Roman horse, or people, should yet gather blackness. For it was but in official symbol and profession that he held the balance of equity. The reality of the case with him, as with Ephraim, was that described by the prophet. The balance of deceit is in his hands. He loves to oppress. The voice of natural equity indeed never, even from the first, ceased its reclamations, and by Alexander Severus, as we saw, there was in a very remarkable manner a waking up of the voice of law in support of it, even as by one who had studied and loved the golden precept of Christianity, "Do unto others as you would have done unto yourself." But it was all in vain. After brief and partial amelioration, the evil triumphed as before. Throughout what remained of the 3rd century, the laws against extortion and injustice, like many others which meet the eye in history, must be looked on rather as records of crime than preventives of its commission. And does it need that I impress upon my readers a sense of the gravity of the evil? With characteristic forethought, the great Trajan likened the undue enlargement of the taxation, with the exacting procurators to collect it, to the morbid enlargement of the spleen in a man's body, causing atrophy. And after Severus's vain attempts at effective amelioration, the history of the sequel illustrates too fully the truth of Trajan's comparison. The general internal wasting of the Roman state resulted from it, as I have already stated from Gibbon. The agriculture of the provinces was insensibly ruined, and thus preparation made for famine, which, as we shall see under the next seal, soon succeeded. In fine, in its not very remote consequences, it involved both the depopulation and desolation of the provinces once the most fertile in the empire, and also personal and family distress, such as to reduce the inhabitants to despair, and to banish from the provincials every sentiment of patriotism. Thus, by anyone that considers the end from the beginning, this epoch of Caracalla's decree cannot but be regarded in the same light in which it has been delineated by the historian, as one of the introduction of fresh and grievous morbid principle into the Roman body politic, under the working of which it would indeed gather blackness. And who then can doubt but that it was a subject deserving prefiguration, or who that it was the very subject prefigured under the seal before us? For surely, I may say, not a particular is there in the emblematic vision that has not been shown to have had its correspondence in the features as noticed by me, of this period of Roman history. In truth, brief as is the description of the figuration in the text, the whole subject of this long chapter seems to pass embodied before us as we once again read it. When he opened the third seal, I beheld, and lo, a black horse, and he that sat on it having a pair of balances in his hand. And I heard a voice, as in the midst of the living creatures, saying, A koinix of wheat for a denarius, and 3 koinix of barley for a denarius, and see that thou wrong not in regard to the oil and wine.
The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on satellite, internet, or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.